Welcome to Future Campus. I'm Tim Winkler. I'm meeting here today with Cameron Neylon from Curtin University. Cameron, you have looked at rankings for a very long time, and you did a really interesting post this week saying rankings up, rankings down. What can we say about Australian university performance based on the Times Higher Education rankings? Basically nothing. Now, can you expand on that a bit for us? Because I thought that was a really interesting line.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of aspects to this. I think the first is if you look at the Times Higher rankings and the data that they're presenting, there is no sense of error margins. And so if you actually look at the data, so I see the University of Melbourne's gone from 39 to 37, and Monash has gone from 58 to 54, Sydney from 61 to 60. Oh my God, everyone's dropping. But if we think about those in statistical terms, so last year, everyone went up in the Times Higher ranking because of a change in methodology. Is everyone down? The year before, I can't even remember, right? So these rankings go up and down, the numbers go up and down. There's no sense of the precision. So even if you think these numbers are important, telling us something important, which I have to admit, I don't, but for those people who are concerned about what these numbers might be saying, they do go up and down. There's random noise in the system. And really all I'm seeing, looking through all of these numbers, is a bunch of small changes, none of which I would consider particularly significant, none of which are being put in the context of the bigger things that are happening. So these are numbers that are now pretty much for the first time starting to report on the pandemic. So these are all lagging indicators. They are several years out of date. So the pandemic's obviously having a massive effect. There is perhaps a trend that most of the Australian universities have slightly lower scores, but those scores are coming from a reputation survey, which is not consistent year to year in any way, shape or form. In my view, is not particularly methodologically sound in any case. And if all the Australian universities have gone down, then that's probably not anything to actually do with the universities themselves or anything that's under the control of the universities. There might be some broader effects, but even there, the changes are tiny. We're talking about, a couple of decimals in a percentage point kind of territory. So it feels like everyone's grabbed a hold of this because it happens to fit with the narrative that they like to be selling at the moment, rather than thinking hard about what this is actually telling us.
Now, I know you've constructed, and with your team, a model which takes in billions of data points and presents a more accurate view, essentially, of where things are at in terms of aspects of research performance, rather than seeking to condense one ranking, although it contributes to a holistic ranking. You noted that there's a second ranking that's come out this week that we haven't seen headlines about, the Leiden ranking open edition. Why is it that we still don't get headlines about that, but we do about the Times Higher Ed one?
In part, it's because the big rankings, they're communications vehicles, they're marketing vehicles. They're not really information sources, but they're very effective at their marketing. And as media organisations, which is what Times Higher is, it's a media organisation. It's good at doing media organisation and therefore reaching the headlines. I think it also, as I said, it fits with a narrative that the sector is, woe is me, we're all in trouble. Why isn't the government giving us more money? This is a great way of lining up with that narrative. So it's something that people have been grabbing a hold of on social media and in other places. And then I think the challenge with something like the Leiden ranking, and particularly the open edition, is that it's telling you much more precise information about what's going on, but it requires a bit of work. It requires a bit of work to dig into. And it's not as clean a story. So what do we see when we look at the release of what's now the second edition of the Leiden ranking, so we can compare to last year? Is that broadly Australian research productivity and certain numbers of research outputs has gone up. The proportion of outputs that are in the top 10% have continued to go up. or the number at least of outputs in the top 10% have gone up. And that's pretty much across the sector. And then we see a continuation of a pattern, which has been the case for a while, that the big universities, big comprehensive GO8 universities, the proportion or the intensity of that top 10% research has stayed pretty static for a while now. And that's been true across the Leiden ranking data for some time, which again, comparable year to year, unlike these other sort of media and narrative marketing driven exercises.
So if
Where
I could just break in there, Cameron, so the story that you're telling is really quite different from the one that we've heard through the headlines through Times Higher Ed, in that at the quality level, at least, things are actually improving.
Well, I think so. This is fundamentally the problem with rankings, right? So rankings are a zero-sum game. We have less investment in the higher education sector in this country than there is in China. There are only 100 places in the top 100. China's going to be putting more universities in the top 100. This is not this is not rocket science. It's not even computer science, which is winning all the Nobel prizes this week. But at the same time, if we don't look at, if we focus on rankings and the notion that we're going backwards because we're not in the top 100, rather than looking at performance in absolute terms and asking whether we're improving year on year, then I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we're doing the sector and the work of Australian researchers a disservice by peddling to a narrative that we're going backwards, when in fact we're actually improving, and the whole world's improving with us, and we're not maybe improving at the same rate as countries that are investing tens or hundreds times more resources in their research sector. But we are increasing the amount of important research that is being produced and coming out. And lots of things we can improve on, obviously, but those are not things necessarily that are captured in these rankings of any sort across them, because they're all focused on the specific things that they measure, not the diversity of activity that a broad-based university is involved in.
So two things that this raises. One, what do I do if I'm a university that has Times Higher Education rankings as part of my KPIs, and suddenly, I've got a bad result this year, but also the pundits are saying it's likely to be bad and getting worse over time. Where do I go with that? If my job is to improve those rankings?
Change your job. So I mean, and I mean that quite seriously. So there is a view, and many people hold this. I think we should be testing it more critically, but there is a view that these rankings do have an effect, particularly on student recruitment and international student recruitment, though maybe that's not the issue that was this year that it was last year. That being the case, I think it's important strategically to engage in the way in which these rankings actually affect the sustainability, revenue turnover, capacities and value that the university is creating. But if that is one of your KPIs, then it should be taken out, because it's not a useful KPI for university leadership in this country at this time. I'm not saying ignore it. It's not important at all, because it does have a material effect on the way the universities are perceived, and potentially, at least to say, people believe it has an effect on student recruitment, which is important, right? No one's going to argue against that. But if it's the number is your KPI, then you're playing a game you're bound to lose, because you're not going to get the same investment as a Chinese or US or other university. But you're also not strategically guiding the university in the right direction, and that's something that university councils, I think, need to take a really hard look at. Again, in terms of positioning the sector for an engaged approach with government and society in the wake of the Accord process, and how we position universities for the future.
Which raises a question, Cameron. You're more deeply involved in research performance analysis than anybody I know. How many councils have reached out to you to ask how best to evaluate whether their university is performing well?
Uh, at this point, none. I think this is not something that's yet kind of risen to that level. I think there are certainly a number of people at the deputy vice chancellor level around the country who we've talked to or who have reached out, and a couple of vice chancellors as well. So there are people thinking about this. But we are kind of in this holding pattern waiting for the minister's response to that specific Accord recommendation on a national research evaluation system. I would argue that this is, in the absence of the minister taking action, the lack of any realistic prospect of the minister taking action prior to the next election, it's an opportunity for the sector to take hold of this agenda itself and articulate for itself what it wants to think about in terms of research performance evaluation. What's the story we want to tell to Australian society at large, to government specifically? So there are big opportunities here. But yeah, at the moment, this is still something that's percolating up through the sort of the policy and performance agenda. And I think people are still maybe relaxing a little too much since ERA went away, and not thinking enough about what that vacuum might end up being filled with if we don't choose to do that ourselves.
I think that's a great way to sum up the conversation today, is that there's a really, we're at an important juncture in terms of taking control of our own story in light of a vacuum nationally.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the light of really substantial shifts happening overseas, I just spent a month actually in Europe, where I went from one meeting to another, which was full of the heads of university networks and vice chancellors and research funders, really pushing out an agenda really embodied in the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment and the agreement on reforming research assessment. And that word reforming is not meant in a light way, it's meant in a really quite radical way. This has been reflected in the ACOLA report for the chief scientist last year. It's there in the Accord, at least in those chapters on the research piece, that research performance evaluation is shifting. And we have lagged behind in that conversation. We have not, as a country, been engaged in that conversation at the leading edge. But we do have an opportunity to do that and to learn from some of the challenges that have been experienced in the implementation of this agenda across Europe and North America.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Cameron. And yet again, great to talk to you.
Thanks, Tim.